get my camera angle set up well, and then we'll get started. Everybody hear me okay? Is that loud enough? Clear enough? Okay. Beautiful. I'm going to be writing a lot on the board. I'm playing video, so I gotta get the camera ready. Alright, who is ready to learn about Hume's problem of induction? Yay! Okay, raise your hand if you read the Hume article. Okay, good. That's a little over half. That's about as much as I expected, so good. And I guess I can't play a cool video because this VGA cable that they put in the room is broken. Looks like somebody stepped on it, so never mind. I'll have to illustrate the video with my hands and with pen on a board. Okay, before we get started, any questions, anything we need to talk about or go over? Everybody okay on finishing up the stuff with symbolic logic, with truth tables? Any questions on that kind of stuff? I don't want to practice a whole lot today, but we can still talk about things if you need to. Any difficulties? Okay, so let's get right into Hume. So if you did the reading, hopefully a lot of us paid close attention to the reading. But I'm going to start from, I guess, the ground up. I kind of introduced this already, but I want to get really clear on exactly what we're talking about. Every day, constantly, not just people who do research, who think abstract thoughts or want to know the truth about the world, but in order to survive, the average human being constantly makes different types of arguments to themselves. They have different types of inferences they make. We've already covered in this class that there are deductive inferences and inductive inferences, right? Really, the better way to put it is that there's deductive relationships and inductive relationships between, let's say, premises or stories, whatever we want to call them, and conclusions or maybe even predictions, right? So we go through our lives every day making inferences like these. Again, one, let's say last time I ate, oh, man, I'm a dork. Last time I ate at IHOP, I got the runs. 2, I never get the runs elsewhere. Conclusion that you can infer. What can you infer from this? I probably got food poisoning there, right? Or at the very least, you'll probably say something like, IHOP was the thing that gave me the runs. Right? I know a crude example, but you can conclude, and then from that you then conclude, I don't think I want to go to the IHOP in Stillwater again, right? And no, this is not a personal story. I don't like IHOP anyway. Not because of this, but I don't go to the one in Stillwater, so it's not personal. Okay. But the point of this is that, is this a deductive argument? Do these premises guarantee the conclusion? No, but we make these types of arguments all the time. So there's no guarantee, right? This relationship doesn't give you any guarantee. It's an inductive inference. It's an inference predicting either the future or the past. It's a prediction that, well, if I go to IHOP again, I might get sick, so I'm going to play it safe and avoid it. Or it's a prediction of the past that we'll never be able to observe that says, well, I think what happened, if I could go back in time, what I would see happen is one of the cooks was sick and they gave me food poisoning, or maybe they just undercooked the food. And those things, I'm predicting the history of why I got diarrhea from IHOP after eating IHOP. So there's these things that we do, these different kinds of predictions that we make. We can make predictions of the past. So we can do past predictions, also called like historical reconstructions. We could do present predictions. I'll get back to that one in a second. And then we can try to predict the future, right? Which is what we normally call just a prediction, right? So we make these three types of predictions all the time. Prediction isn't just about telling the future. Prediction is also about reconstructing what made something happen, reconstructing something's history. They can also be theories or predictions about, well, what's going on right now that makes the world the way it is? What's actually happening behind the scenes that explains what's going on here right now? So in all three of these types of things we do, we're making some sort of prediction of something we can't see. Does that make sense? Of something we can't directly observe. So what a theory is, in general, theory just equals some sort of prediction of something we can't know via direct observation. Right? A theory is just a prediction of something that we can't know via direct observation. Now, you might be thinking, well, hold on a second, like, don't historians know things through observation? No. They know things, they get data from observing, but can any historian go back in time and look at what happened? No. They find data in the present that exists, and then predict from that data what happened in the past. They try to reconstruct the past. Scientists do similar things when we're talking about physics, right? They find occurrences that happen here and now, they do experiments here and now, and then postulate or predict maybe what's happening right now or what's happening in the past that, like the Big Bang explains why we're all here right now, right? But they can also use the laws of nature and the generalizations they make to predict things into the future. That's why NASA's able to send people to the moon, right? Because they understand enough about the general laws of physics and they know what's going on right now, they then make a prediction that if they shoot a rocket at this speed, in this direction, on this day, at this time, it'll end up going to the moon. There's no guarantee. The calculations aren't perfectly precise or certain. And there's never any observation of that the rocket's actually going to go there, right? That's something they can't observe. So the point of having these theories of this type of what's called theoretical reasoning is that you're trying to get knowledge of something that you cannot just look out and figure out whether it's true or not, or discover what's happening just by looking. Does that make sense? Okay. Most things in life that are interesting, you can't just figure out just by looking for them. Like, what's something you can figure out just by looking at it? The seeds are orange, right? But can you figure out what the nature of orange is just by looking at the seeds? No, right? Just by looking at the seed, you'll never figure out that what's actually going on is what orange is a certain wavelength of light interacting with your sensory organs, being processed through a chain of neurological connections, then whatever the mind or the soul is the brain interacting with the mind so that you have this phenomenal experience, right? This mental image of that color. Just by looking at that, you don't know any of that. You just see orange. You have this experience, orange. And we can all talk fairly commonsensically about, yeah, that's orange. We all kind of see the same things. But is a person who's colorblind able to know that's orange? Well, there's a certain type of colorblind, no, right? So even then, it depends on where you are, it depends on your faculties and what your abilities are, right? But you can't know essentially truths about the world that are deeper than just descriptions of what you are directly seeing or experiencing from observation. Any claim about how the world really is, any claim about deeper truths of why the world is the way it is not known through direct observation. It's observation leading to predictions, or observations used in support of some sort of predictive theory about how things really are. Can any of us in this room even know that any of us exist just by looking? Probably not, right? Just watch The Matrix, right? That's the cliche philosophy movie. Yeah, you can't even know that the external world exists just by looking around. You can only know I am having this mental experience. But you don't even know what I is. What is the thing having the mental experience? What is the mental experience? Am I a brain in a jar, or is something outside of me causing me to have this mental experience? How does that work? So with all those sorts of things, you need predictions or theoretical reasoning to basically know anything interesting about the world other than just, I am feeling pleasure, I am feeling pain, I see this, right? Make sense? Okay. So, man, I wish I could play this video. It would have been a cool video. Have you guys ever heard of Brownian motion? Anybody like biology or physics or chemistry? No? Okay. So, ancient Greek philosophers postulated that the atoms existed, right? The atoms made everything else up. One of Einstein's most famous contributions was that he gave an argument basically confirming the existence of atoms, right? And that was like a big thing. So in the early 1900s, like, people were still doubtful whether atoms really existed or if it was something else. And what Einstein did, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm going to butcher this, and no, I don't understand the science behind it completely. But Einstein looked at, I can't remember his name, something Brown, some of the experiments he had done with droplets of milk on a slide in a microscope. And he got these tiny droplets of milk and put them on the slide and looked, I think he magnified it like 1,000 times, and looked and he saw all these particles, right? Not atoms, but particles, like milk particles. And they would float around in here. They're always moving. And you couldn't see anything else. It looked like they were just moving in space, right? The thing about these particles is that they weren't just moving in straight lines. Now you would think, if you know anything about the history of science, Newton and Descartes and all the other physicists, they thought that you've got perpetual motion, right? So if an atom or a particle starts going this way, it's just going to keep moving in that straight line until something hits it and moves it and causes it to go a different way, right? Well, the problem is that's not what these things are doing. They're just floating in empty space and they're bouncing around like crazy. They're going like this, right? So imagine all these dots kind of just moving like crazy around this. All right, if you see all these particles moving and it doesn't look like anything's moving them, why are they moving? Can anyone come up with an idea? If there's nothing in here, at least that we can see, and all these milk particles are moving around, what's causing them to move around in a weird, erratic ways?
Maybe like the positive ions hitting each other, like the homogeneous ions deflecting each other, not like negative and positive.
Well, but remember the ion is part of an atom. They don't know that yet.
So then it's just something you can't see.
Well, exactly. So you're both right. It's something you can't see, but what is it? Now, there's a couple explanations, right? The first explanation, I'm just going to call it H1 for hypothesis 1, could be that, well, it's a fundamental law of nature that these milk particles move around like this. So a fundamental law that explains why they're just like crazy erratic going like that. That kind of strikes us like, that kind of seems ad hoc, right? Like that's just invented. That seems too good to be true. Why would these be fundamental and there just happens to be a law, milk particles will move like that? Weird. Okay, hypothesis 2. You say something like God is moving all of them like that. Okay, you can come up with a bunch of different hypotheses. And then eventually you hit at this hypothesis that seems intuitively plausible. There are things here that we can't see. In fact, there are a shit ton of atoms, of little units. Whatever they are, they still don't really know what these little units are. But there's a bunch of tiny little dots in here, tiny little atoms, that you can't see in the microscope. And that these particles, these bigger particles, are actually, as they float around, as they move, hitting these atoms. And then, say you're watching it move erratically, it goes in this line, oh, it bumps into an atom, oh, it goes that way. Bumps into another atom, oh, it goes that way. Right? You can't see those atoms. You don't know by direct observation that they're there. But what you're doing is you're giving a prediction of what's really going on, even though you can't observe it. And from that point on, most people started to believe in atoms. It wasn't until I think 2009 that you could actually see an atom, right? That you had an electron microscope powerful enough to see the atom and its parts. And even then, or maybe it was 2004, I can't remember. I wish I had the video. IBM had a technique for looking at atoms that you weren't really looking at it through a microscope. It was just kind of reconstructing pixels, so where when it would run across, it was like a very sharp little needle, and it would run across and bump into an atom, and then it would record one pixel, boom, there, a little dot of light for when it hit that atom, and boom, and it would like just construct essentially indirectly a picture of the atom. That wasn't until my lifetime that you got stuff like that, right? But they knew atoms existed, but they can never confirm them. So that's the use of theory in things like science. I mean, even things like atomic theory, you have to have these sorts of predictions. Is that making sense, how this is used not just in everyday reasoning, but in something like science? All right, I don't understand much more about atomic theory or science other than that, so I'll stick to more humanities-based stuff, right? So give me an example of a historical reconstruction. Like, what would a historical prediction look like? You could just make one up.
Egyptians worshipped cats.
Say that again?
Egyptians worshipped cats.
Okay, so is that what you're trying to, that's your hypothesis, that Egyptians worshipped cats?
Sure, yeah.
So let's say we've got this hypothesis, Egyptians worshipped cats. Why do you think that? Like we can totally make this up, but what would an archaeologist or a historian find that would lead them to make that hypothesis?
Like stuff like vases that look like cats and like drawings of cats and sculptures, stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, so we've got essentially here, let's call this, if you remember the book, the explanandum, or just E, for the puzzling event. So puzzling, I hate this pen, puzzling event, or data that puzzles us. We run into all this stuff that we want to figure out why it's there, why it's happening. And so we've got E, a puzzling event. We're finding a lot of cat-themed pottery. Okay. Now, are there other explanations for that other than Egyptians worshipped cats, right? But one hypothesis is that cats had some sort of religious role in Egyptian society. Hypothesis 2, can anybody come up with a different hypothesis?
There was one potter who made a lot of cat stuff.
Wait, hold on. one at a time. Who's first?
Hieroglyphics.
What do you mean by hieroglyphics?
Like cats would be like gods in like the hieroglyphics, like they would be depicted like that. People would be like worshiping them.
Okay, so that's like more data, right? But what would a hypothesis be to explain? Let's just say we find a lot of cat-themed pottery in hieroglyphics. That's our data. And in some of these images, we find people bowing down before a cat. So some images of people bowing down to cats. I don't know if any of this is historically accurate, but you know, whatever. Or cat-like figures. Okay, so we know our data, we go on archaeological dig and we find that a lot of cat-themed pottery, the Egyptians seem to like cats. There's a lot of hieroglyphics, and some of those images on the hieroglyphics look like people bowing down to cats. So one explanation is that cats had a religious role in Egyptian society and were worshipped. Is that a guarantee? No. Can someone come up with another explanation?
Cats were really good companions.
Yeah, cats were really good companions. So we could say Egyptians valued cats. And had a cat culture or something. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's like, if somebody dug up all of our computers and saw like the dumb images of like cat memes or whatever we had, or if we were an animal lover, they would find similar stuff of like, why are they taking such good care of their cats or their animals or something? So it's not that ridiculous of a hypothesis. So Egyptians valued cats, but they had no religious function. Anybody come up with a third explanation?
Maybe they fear cats.
They fear cats.
Oh.
They're bowing down in fear.
Sure, okay, they're bowing down. They're trying to. It sounds like there's a cat in the room. Trying to appease cats for some strange reason because they're afraid of them, right? And I'm not saying these are all good theories or whatever. But the point is, maybe I could even have hypothesis 4, that cats had a religious role in Egyptian society. Let's say this one is, but not worshipped. Because maybe cats had a religious role in Egyptian society because they're a symbol of a god or a goddess. But you're not worshiping the cat, you're worshiping the god that's symbolized by the cat, right? And then you could say, well, cats were gods or were worshipped in Egyptian society. Now, the point of all this is all of these are compatible with the data. So you can't say, I found this data, this one must be true. We know this one's true, right? It's not that cats were gods in Egypt, it's that they're symbols of God. I can't remember which goddess the cat was associated with.
It was vast.
Thank you. Fast push-ups. That's my God. Amen. But the point is that in order to do these very basic historical type of theories, in order to be a historian at all, you have to be able to reconstruct the past with these sorts of uncertain, probabilistic, inductive predictions, right? Okay, so we get the idea, I think, of like how this is done. It's pretty natural for us to do this. But let's just look at the form real quick of what these explanations do. So an explanation or a theory or a hypothesis, they're all the same. They're all the same thing. No one in the philosophical or scientific literature thinks that these are all different things. Now you'll hear science popularizers saying, well, the theory of evolution is a theory, it's not a hypothesis. And theories you take seriously, and hypotheses are just kind of like guesses. It's just not, like, it's just a, I guess if they're defining it that way, fine, it makes sense. But it's just not something, there's no distinction here. Hypothetical reasoning, theoretical reasoning, explanatory reasoning, they're all the same thing. So just keep in mind, I'm going to say explanation, theory, hypotheses. I'm going to use these interchangeably. What an explanation is, or a theory or hypothesis, is a story that makes sense of some puzzling data. Right? Story that makes sense of some puzzling data. So I can have, let's just say my hypothesis, hypothesis 1, and I have some puzzling data or a puzzling event, let's call it E. The idea is that I come up with a hypothesis that would lead me to understand why this happened. This is in terms of the historical reconstructions or explanatory reasoning that you're trying to figure out what happened in the past, not future predictions necessarily. But I'm trying to come up with a story or a set of facts that would shed light on or make sense of this explanation. Looking at this example, right? Say I go out and I try to start my car and my car is just dead. It won't turn over, it won't make any noise when I turn the key. Someone give me an explanation for that.
Your start is bad.
The starter's bad. Okay, here's hypothesis 1. Bad starter.
Dead battery.
Good. Hypothesis 2. Dead battery. Hypothesis 3.
Your engine was stolen.
Hey, it's a hypothesis, yeah. Now these hypotheses, they don't have to be
You have an
intuitive.
electric car.
What?
You have an electric car.
Or
Oh,
you're,
so I'm using a key and there's no point for me to use a key.
or
That's
you're
fine.
in someone else's car.
That's what I was
I'm in someone else's car. So maybe I can even say, wrong car, yeah.
There is no car.
You want an message?
Wrong car, wrong key. Alright.
It's a construct.
Okay, the other, I'll say one more. This actually happened with someone I know. You say rats chewed the ignition cables. Yeah, in Southern California, we used to have these big ass, fat ass rats that would just crawl up in your car at night. They're everywhere, and they would just like chew up the wires in your car. You have to replace your entire wiring harness. Yeah, it's crazy. Mice did it too. But there's a lot of palm trees in Southern California, and rats really like to live in palm trees. Who would have thought? Okay, anyway, so we got all these hypotheses, and the point about each of them is that if this was true, that would imply or explain that the car's not going to start, right? So this, it implies, and I'm talking deductively implies that the car's not going to start, right? If you've got a bad starter and it's like completely failed, then when you turn the key, nothing's going to happen, right? So this implies, let's just say E, the event, car won't start. Well, H2, if it's truly a completely dead battery, the car's not going to start either, right? And that implies, if it's a dead battery, then E, the puzzling event, the car's not going to start. Same with the engine being stolen, right? Same with being in the wrong car and having the wrong key. The car's probably not going to start. Rats chewed through the cables. If they really did that bad of damage and ripped the cables completely, it's not going to start. So the point is, you've got all these different hypotheses. And every single one of them would lead you to expect or imply the truth of E, the puzzling event you just observed, right? So there's a relationship here, a logical relationship. Does this make sense so far? So when I say a story that makes sense of, right, some event, what this really ends up meaning is that an explanation is a story that implies or makes likely. This marker smells horrible. Jeez.
Can you smell through that thing?
Unfortunately, yeah. Trust me. It's bad. It actually gets rid of a lot of like the normal smells, like aerosols. but then you just smell like the gross stuff, because like the smell of like, I don't know, say shit, is not necessarily aerosolized, but they're tiny particles that are like floating up. That's what smells are. And so this blocks the big aerosols, doesn't block the little things. So I smell mostly the bad stuff. Anyway, a story that implies or makes likely. If it implies, what type of reasoning is that?
It's inductive.
Mm-mm. Deductive with implication. What's the arrow? It implies. So this is deductive. Now what's makes likely? That's inductive, right? Deductive, inductive. A story that deductively, if this were true, it would imply this. Or, in the case of, let's say, wrong car, wrong key, it's conceivable that your wrong key in the wrong car would still work, but it's probably not going to, right? So if H4 were true, then the car not starting, it would be very likely, right? So a story that implies or makes likely some puzzling event. Okay, making sense? Everybody following along? I don't think this is that unintuitive or strange. Okay, but as you can see, just by looking at E, right, there's no guarantee of which one of these are true. The task we have is figuring out, well, yeah, I could essentially, little children can make up all the stories they want, but we're big adults. We want to know what's actually, which one of these is true. Maybe multiple of them are true. Maybe someone stole your engine and you have a bad starter, or some combination. But how do we essentially go from just purely making shit up, making up all these possible stories, to saying this is the correct one? Does that make sense? How do we do that?
Experiment?
Okay, experiment. What type?
You steal someone's engine out of their car and see if it starts.
Yeah, true. But this is about my engine, right? So that wouldn't prove it.
Then we steal your engine.
Well, but the question is it already stolen? Let's say, how can I do an experiment to see if H3 is true or false?
You go look.
Observe if you're
Yeah, what do I do? What's the experiment that I perform?
Pop the hood.
Yeah, I pop the hood and I look. Yeah. So let's say I pop the hood and I look. And that is a type of experiment, right? I go, okay, is there an engine there? There's an engine there. Bye-bye. That one's ruled out, right? Okay, what's another type of experiment we could do to rule things out?
Put a new battery in it.
You could put a new battery in, or you could test your old battery. Let's say you test your old battery and it shows that's completely fine. Well, that actually starts to suggest that the battery one is not the problem. You run another experiment, you put a new battery in, and it's still doing the same thing. It wasn't the battery. Cross that out. Right? So the role of an experiment in science or in anything else is not to come up with theories, it's to test theories, right? And by test, I mean look for evidence that says this one's not true, this one's not true, this one's not true, this one's not true, until I'm left with the one. Okay. Everybody, is this really making sense? Do you get it? Here's Hume's problem. I've already showed you how this, obviously, once you start reading science and not just textbooks, but if you actually get into science or history or anything, even in matters of interpretation, right? Like when we talked about hieroglyphics. This is going to bug me. This is the feedback. If we talk about hieroglyphics and you see a little picture of people bowing down to a cat, oh my God, what is this? That's a cat, everybody. Wee. Thank you. You see a hieroglyphic of a little man bowing down to a cat. There's multiple explanations of interpretation. There's multiple interpretations that fit. He could be worshiping him. He could be pleading with him not to kill his family, right? Who knows? But the point is, you obviously, I think, see how this has a central place in basically all of human reasoning. Now, here's what Hume says. Hume says all of these types of explanation all kinds of theory, of explanation, of prediction. Again, whether that be predictions of the future or predictions of how the past was. All types of theory, well, let's say rely on, these tabs keep going off, rely on inductive inferences. Okay, premise one. All kinds of theory, of explanation, of prediction rely on inductive inferences. I think that's pretty much true. I guess you can have mathematical theories, but that's a very different sort of thing. Mathematical logical theories are just like intuitively obvious or something like that, you don't need it. But again, there is the question of, is math really true? How do we know? Well, it's by, we really intuitively feel and can't imagine 2 + 2 = 4 being wrong. But then there's still, you could say, the inductive inference of, if something is so strongly intuitive and there's no reason to think it's false, then it probably is true. This board just does not cooperate with me. So you could say with something even like math or logic, if something's really strongly intuitive and we don't have any evidence against it, then really the most we could say is that's probably true. So even math might rely on induction, but that's a topic for another day, right? Okay, so all kinds of theories rely on inductive inferences. Hume then says all inductive inferences are unjustified. Now, whether he really believes this, I don't think so, but he's challenging us to find a way to answer that objection. Right? I don't think he ends up believing it. Okay, all inductive inferences are unjustified. What follows from that?
P1 is like all of them are false.
Yeah, all the different kinds of theory, no matter the discipline, they rely on something unjustified, and that compromises their integrity. Right? So why does Hume think that all inductive inferences are unjustified from the reading? Who can tell me?
Because they like logical fallacy, like they beg the question, because to say that like something is inductively true, you have to rely on the principles of induction that we define, which are like defined by our own induction. So it becomes like a circular thing where you're saying this is true because I believe this other thing is true, but this other thing is true because I believe, this and that.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's actually really good. That explanation that you just gave involves like 3 or 4 different parts. But yeah, you're right. That is pretty much exactly what he's saying. So to summarize that, let me just put like a general argument form up on the board, or an example of an argument. This is the one that's favorite in textbooks. So the sun has risen every day in past human experience. Two, well, let's just go from there. I'm just going to leave a little nice gap. The conclusion is then the sun will rise tomorrow. Okay. I think last time I introduced this, most of us pretty much agreed that, like, yeah, this is at least, we would normally see this type of argument and be like, yeah, that's a fine argument. Yeah, there's no guarantees. Maybe the world ends tomorrow. But at least in terms of how I'm going to live my life, yeah, I'm going to bet that the sun's going to rise tomorrow, right? It's probably going to rise tomorrow. So we've got this notion of support or justification of warrant or probability a warranting relationship between the premise or this, again, this is observational data, right? If we wanted to be good little statistics nerds, we could say like, 100 out of 100 times human beings have observed the world, the sun has risen, right? I know it's a lot more than 100, but that's the ratio, right? So in terms of the past, the ratio of times the sun has risen to times human beings have seen a new day are 1 to 1. It's 100% guarantee that in the past, the sun always rises in human experience. Does this ratio, does it basically being a past guarantee that the future will be like that? No. And Hume's problem, he's not so much saying, here's a direct argument why this is bullshit. He's saying, who can explain to me what this is, what this relationship is? Does that make sense? If we can understand, if we can use this all the time, these type of arguments, then why can't we explain what the relationship between premises or data and an inductively inferred conclusion is? What is it to make something probable? What is it to support, or for this to somehow raise the probability of this? Does anyone want to take a guess? What does it mean that this gives you support or justification for this?
Can you say that again?
So what does it mean for premises like this, based on past experience, to then give you justification for believing this? In other words, how does this make this probable?
It's like the more of the same like principle. I think it's mentioned in like a list of reading.
Okay, right. So here's the questions that Hume is raising. I need to pull up my argument forms to make sure I write them down correctly. I always come up with my own. Okay, we've got question 1. What is non-deductive or inductive inference? Let me get room. What is non-deductive inference? 2, how do I want to phrase this? What sort of like principles, I guess we could say? Like you're raising the principle of more of the same. I'll get into that in a second. But I guess the simplest way would be to ask, how does it work? How does non-deductive, aka inductive inference, work? And then 3, how does it justify our conclusions? Now what you just said was that an answer to these questions are, there are certain logical principles that are hidden here. There are certain hidden or tacit principles of induction or explanation that if we just could describe those, we would see, yeah, this actually does make good sense of this. So here's one of these potential principles. So let's just say potential solution 1, PS1. The past will always resemble the future. The past will always resemble the future. So what we do here is we then plug this principle into here, right? And I make it sort of like a premise, and I say, well, the past will always resemble the future, or you can say the future will resemble the past either way. And then you say, okay, look, every day in the past the sun's risen. The past and the future are going to resemble each other. There's going to be some sort of continuity. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Good argument? Raise your hand if you think that's a good argument.
If you subscribe
If you subscribe to the principle, yeah, that's the question.
How can you not?
How can you not? Well, you could just be like Hume and end up being a skeptic. I mean,
But if for the past 7 billion years the sun has risen, why tomorrow won't it?
But if you apply it to something else like human suffering, like, okay, there's been slavery in the past, so there's gonna be slavery in the future, or something to that
I mean,
sort.
there has been slavery in the past and there is slavery today.
Yeah, he's right.
Yeah.
I mean, the past
Yeah, but-
resembles and it always does.
right. So I think that what we're seeing is like, we could recognize that, yeah, like this, I think somehow these do give us warrant or justification for the conclusion. But will the past always resemble the future?
No.
No, it's a bad principle, right?
Even so, I don't know, resemble, I don't know, maybe I'm being nitpicky, but I feel like resemble can still hint at like it's not guaranteed. I feel like you would have to say the past will repeat in the future, because resemble doesn't necessarily mean, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
I don't know.
Yeah, so no, resemble doesn't mean it's going to be the exact same. That means it's going to be similar. So there's going to be some degree of resemblance or continuity. But the thing is, I mean, is it true? Is this principle just true? Do we know that the past will always resemble the future? No.
I mean, shouldn't it be that the future will resemble the past? No, doesn't.
It's the same thing, yeah. I mean, if I resemble you, then that means he resembles me, right? So yeah, you could say the future will resemble the past, right? But yeah, there's still no guarantee. I mean, on the one hand, I think all of us can recognize that this is in some way a good argument, but in some way it makes us uncomfortable when we're able to think up problems. So how can we kind of like get rid of this confusion and cognitive dissonance in our heads? Well, we could try to find another principle, right? So this one was bad because there's no real reason to think this. In order to think this, you have to be able to do a prediction anyway, right? This is still predictive. So if you're saying, I'm going to save this inductive argument by making it even more predictive and inductive, you've got a problem, right? Okay, can anybody come up with another principle?
Could you say like the sun rotates around, or revolves around the earth?
Okay, so now what you can do, what you're trying to do is you're trying to give some sort of causal principle or mechanism. That if we understood everything about this causal mechanism, then we'd be able to then say, well, tomorrow, because this mechanism is turning, essentially, the sun is revolving at a certain speed, and there's all these causal relationships between these astronomical bodies, well then tomorrow, we're going to have the sun rising tomorrow, right? So we could, I'm not an astronomer, so I can't give you a principle of astronomy like that, right? But it could be something like, find a causal principle that warrants the prediction. Okay, we could do that. What's the problem with that though? If I then put here for 2, let's just say I could say something like, whatever caused the sun to rise before, why is it feedback so bad? Whatever caused the sun to rise before will cause it again tomorrow, so the sun will rise tomorrow. Anybody see any problems with this?
It's the same.
It's the same freaking thing. Yeah, this is still just a prediction that the causal processes and mechanisms that went on yesterday will go on tomorrow. And so it ends up being this. So we've got no matter how hard we try, the point of Hume is no one has ever been able to answer these questions. He's asked his philosopher buddies, he's asked his scientist buddies, and philosophers have been doing this for thousands of years, and no one has ever figured out exactly how you bridge this gap. We can't use these 2 principles because they both end up being predictive, and this one ends up reducing to this one anyway.
How would a, like, religious principle, like, change this argument? Like, if you're like, God is causing this to do this, or this higher power is causing this.
This is Rene Descartes. He thought that the natural laws of the universe were ordained by God, and because God is perfect, he will not change. Not that he cannot, but that there's a guarantee he will not change what he's done. Fundamental. Because God is unchanging. That's part of perfection, right? So you could give a religious principle. You could say, well, God keeps the universe regular. Right? In that there's some sort of God-driven regularity to the universe. And if I put this in here, that obviously doesn't mean that every single thing's going to always stay the same. Like, God could want something to change. But at least something like that for our fundamental, like, laws of matter or how things move. The presumption is that if God wants us to be able to understand this world, he will keep it regular so we can pick up on these regularities and trust them. So let's say something like the sun has risen every day in past human experience. God will keep past causes working in the future with some degree of regularity. Therefore, the sun will rise tomorrow. Any problems with this one?
Well, I mean, you have to assume God exists and also that God wants to keep everything regular.
Right, you have to assume God exists, which Hume is one of the agnostics of the Enlightenment, right? So he wouldn't agree with this. I think God exists, and I think this is probably true. But what defines the degree of regularity, and why is this one thing the thing that God will keep tomorrow? There's still no guarantee, right? So every single one of these principles that we've looked at hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked for a couple of reasons. It hasn't worked, let's just say problem one. It hasn't worked because any principle of regularity relies itself on prediction. And so gives no guarantee. Again, when I say guarantee, I mean deductive guarantee. We've learned enough about deduction and truth tables to know what a deductive guarantee is, right? If the premises are true, that conclusion has to follow, right? So even with these principles, there's still no guarantee. And he wants some sort of guarantee, right? Okay, problem two. Any causal principle, right? So like this, the causal mechanisms of astronomy are going to work yesterday just like they work today, or God will keep causing the universe to be regular. Any causal principle has no guarantee either. Right? They're still uncertain. And it seems like Hume wants certainty, right? He wants a way to figure out why. He wants at least a way to show that premises and inductive arguments can get you some sort of guarantee that the conclusion's probable. But even with these that we've looked at, it's just not happening. Okay, and then there's a deeper problem with causal principle too. So any causal principle relies on causality, or the concept of causality. Someone define the concept of causality? What is causality?
Isn't it just that one thing will make another thing happen?
One thing makes another thing happen. What is that?
Cause and effect.
Yeah, no, yeah, but what is that?
Um,
Regularity, right?
Two things can be regularly correlated without being causes. Every single day, 2 + 2 = 4, and every single day I wake up and I'm still a boy.
One thing acts on another.
One thing acts on another, so one thing makes another, one thing causes an effect, one thing acts on another. What do those mean?
Like, are you asking for like deductive or inductive?
No, I just want to know, what is the nature of cause and effect, of causal relationships?
You have to depend on the fact that the cause will happen. Is that kind of what?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that.
You have to predict that a cause will happen, but
Yeah.
I mean, true, you have to predict that. That is a problem, but that's again the prediction problem. This is a problem with a metaphysical problem with the notion of cause and effect itself. What is it?
We don't really know.
No. You think philosophers have not been thinking about it? No one knows. Still to this day. How do you define an electron? Yeah, an electron. What is the definition of an electron? What is it?
it's a negatively charged particle.
What is a negative charge? It's a negatively charged particle, but what is a negative charge?
The opposite of a positive.
The opposite of positive. What is a positive charge?
And there you go.
It's just a force that exists in nature.
It's a force that exists in nature. What is a force?
We don't know yet.
Something with the magnetic
A
field.
force is a power. A force is a power that has an effect. Circle. We're back. A force, if you read any textbook on atomic theory or chemistry, and when they introduce what an atom is, they say it's really hard to give a definition of positive and negative, because we know that we can observe that the electron does something to other atoms. There is a force where somehow the electron, I can't remember, do electrons push away or pull in? If it's negative, it pushes away, it repulses, right? If it's positive, it comes in, it attracts.
It depends on the charge of the different particles.
It depends on your overall charge, yeah, your overall valence, right? So let's just say you have a positively charged atom, okay? Overall, it's positive. That is going to, when you look at it and other atoms come into its orbit, it pushes them away.
If they're also positive.
Right, if they're also positive. But the point is that there's no relationship between them that you can observe. It's just, wow, this thing happened and then this thing happened. This thing's like this, and then it causes the other ones to move away. So this must be causing something. It must have the power to move, to repel others. It must have a force. Like the force is literally just another way to say a causal power. So even at that fundamental level, you just can't define causality. Hume's example is that if I have a billiard ball A and a billiard ball B, and I look and I observe these as hard as anyone else can, and I push the billiard ball A and it hits B, what's it going to cause B to do?
It's gonna move.
Right. But what is that cause? What's making it do it? Right? You can look inside of A. Let's say before that happens, you look inside of A and you ask, what gives it the power to, if I pushed it and it hit B, that it would repel B, that it would make B move? What explains that? If I just look in A, where is the causal power in A to move B?
Is it just the fact that they're two solid objects, and so solid objects can bounce off each other?
Sure, but does that tell you why? It's just a generalization about what causes what. So Hume's entire point is that we don't have a concept of causality. We don't have a concept of causality, and people that like science might say, look, yeah, we don't have one, we have to go deeper and go to the atomic level to explain why these two things interact. But the problem is you get to the atomic level and you just have these tiny billiard balls called electrons, and you still can't explain it. So there's some sort of concept of causality that we think we have, but Hume is basically saying no one can explain it to me, no one has ever been able to figure it out. It seems like actually our only real notion of causality is just tight correlation. So what Hume is basically saying is that there is no real such thing as causality. Or if there is, we don't really know what it is. It's purely tight correlation. We say that the billiard ball A causes B to move just because we've looked around and every time we have moved A and smacked A into B, B's moved, and we've never seen it fail. So we just end up saying, well, because they're always correlated, A causes B. But that's just a fancy way or a different way of talking about correlations that we've never seen fail. Does that make sense? Okay, so the problem just becomes, look, if you give any sort of principle that relies on cause and effect, like causal principles that astronomy is going to say the same, you don't even know what causality is. So how can you be giving me a principle based on causality when this is all so murky and unjustified anyway? Does that make sense? Okay, so we've seen predictive principles like the past will always resemble the future or more of the same. Those don't work because they face the same problem of induction. They're still predictions. Causal principles, they are either still just predictions that face the same problem, or they are relying on the notion of causality that we don't even know what the hell it is. So how do we save inductive arguments? And if that inductive relationship, like we showed, affects everything that we see, essentially, that we reason about, in history and science, like I explained with the hieroglyphics, I gave you examples of the car not starting. If these problems face all those kinds of reasoning, then how do we save this and basically secure our knowledge? Because if there's no solution, if we can't rely on any of these principles, and we can't find another principle, then we can't really ever have knowledge about pretty much anything. Right? Does that make sense? So what's the solution?
So could you inductively say that, I mean, you'd have to rely on more induction, but that the answer lies outside of human reason?
The answer lies outside of human reason.
Like, we just can't figure it out.
Yeah, but then
it exists.
why do humans use, like, if the answer and the principles of induction are outside of human reasons, then why are we so good at using them without being able to explain them, right? In a certain, yeah.
It could just be something in the human mind, the human brain, something with our neurons, and if you know, whether you believe the mind and the brain are the same thing or if they're different, it's just something that everyone has, everyone's born with, that it's just, you can't explain it.
Yeah, I mean, even mentally handicapped people, I'm not trying to be rude, but take someone with severe Down syndrome, they can still use this, right? Like, they are not, like a very severe case of Down syndrome, a human being with severe Down syndrome is still way smarter than like a gorilla, right? They can reason in way more complex ways. So it's like, yeah, it seems like it might be a part of like human nature in some way to reason this way. But then the question becomes, why does human nature justify it? Like, why are the principles of thought that humans use, basically, the thought is, well, maybe it's just a basic psychological principle of thinking. Okay, but then how does that basic psychological principle allow us to know the truth about anything? Psychology is not normative. It's just purely a description of how human beings work. So we want, if psychologists discover that there's ways of reasoning that are universal, there's still the question of why should we use these? Why are they good ways of reasoning? So even that doesn't work, right? Yeah, so that's why it's so tricky. No matter what you come up with, you just hit this wall that you can't get past. So Hume's three questions, again, what is non-deductive inference? That makes sense. I think we have the answer to that. What is non-deductive inference? Or what is inductive inference? It's just a movement from premises to conclusions in a way that does not result in a guarantee of logical necessity. It is probability, right? So we can answer question one. But question 2 and 3 are where it gets hard. How does it work? Is essentially asking, what principles are we using? What is the principle that says, essentially, here's a good example. Let's just say that the probability of the sum, well, I'll get something simpler. Let's say that P is PR. R represents the number of, well, no, wait. R is all of the people in the world who are conscious, right? Who have some sort of mental life, who aren't like vegetables or aren't in a coma. So the probability that somebody is conscious, right? In terms of statistics, no, this is a bad example, I'm sorry. That's just going to confuse everyone more. Okay, how about this? The probability that men have anger problems. Let's just make up some number. Does anybody know this? Does anybody know the actual number? I remember reading about it a while ago, but let's just say it's like 70% of men have anger management problems. Might be higher.
It's probably.
Right. We can represent it as a fraction, 70 out of 100, right? What is this fraction? What does this number represent?
Every 70 out of 100 men.
Mm-hmm. Every 70 out of what 100 men?
Any?
Mm-mm. What about the future men?
Current men.
Current, past, and present.
That's all men.
Of observed men. Yeah, that's how you say it, right? Any sort of statistical ratio is not a probability in terms of what we're talking about. It is basically just a recorded number of past occurrences. So the question is, if I have something that's 70% probable, statistically, right, in terms of frequencies of occurrences in the past, how does this get me to the, let's just say, a 70% probability in terms of an epistemic probability or like justification or warrant, right? Because we use these words in different ways. Let's just say a 70% probability that my new boyfriend or something will have these problems too, right? How do we get from basically percentages and ratios that are just about past observances to a prediction that in the future, those are the chances that the next guy I meet is also going to have these problems? We do that all the time though, right? Like if oh my God, like with COVID, like how could you ever deny that we do this type of stuff, right? Like when anybody says like, if you're vaccinated, you are only 7 out of 100 vaccinated people end up in the hospital from COVID. Okay, so if I say 7 out of 100 hospitalized for COVID, I then conclude, after I'm vaccinated, that my chances are only 7%, right? So because in the population, we've only seen 7% or 7 over 100 people hospitalized once they're vaccinated, my chances are only 7%, right? We do that type of stuff all the time. Hume is asking, what is this relationship I'm representing with the arrow? So, essentially, what principles are we using? One of them is, what is the relationship between statistics or statistical ratios or statistical probabilities and future predictions or even predictions of the past, right? Does that make sense, the question I'm asking? Okay. And then finally, obviously, these two are going to be related. How does it justify our conclusions? If we could give some principle that explains how this works, then obviously that would help us justify it, right? So these two are basically the same question, just phrased differently. Okay, what time is it?
2:41.
What time did we get out? 2:45?
Yeah, so you got
Okay.
4 minutes.
Cool. Okay, so that's Hume's problem. Any questions or comments?
Can you just boil down question 2 to instinct?
Say again.
Can you just, like, I mean, in my mind, can you just say that the question to, or the answer to question 2 rather is just instinct?
Wait, it's just instinct?
Yeah, that's like human instinct.
Oh, human instinct. Yeah, but then you have the problem of, like, what makes human instinct a reliable guide to truth? Yeah. Any other questions?
So he published this in the 1700s, right?
Yeah.
And philosophers have been working on it since, and there's
Mhm.
nothing yet.
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah. The response was, for a while, a lot of philosophers took that exact instinct argument and then took Sophia's psychological argument and said, essentially, the human mind just has these fundamental ways of reasoning, and we just have to trust them. Or not even that. They basically thought that psychology could solve these problems, but then the question still becomes, well, psychology is just descriptions of how we think, it's not how we should think. So what explains why this psychological pattern works? And so you had, in logic, you had people called the psychologists, or the psychologistic school of logic, who were trying to solve this problem and also other problems by just reducing logic to psychology. That's been defeated, that's dead, that's done. Philosophers don't believe that anymore, most of them, because of the philosophers who ended up developing the logic we're learning. Frege, Bertrand Russell, C.S. Peirce, they all basically fought against that, but like philosophers ever get out of their chairs. But they basically dismantled that and showed that there's that problem, right? That doesn't work either. So we're still just left with this, and we don't really have a direct solution.
Do you think it's ever going to get solved?
No. I think it's a fundamental boundary of human reason. I think this goes back, and I'll talk about the not possible solutions, but forms of solutions, like what we're looking for next time. And I think what that reveals is that there are boundaries to human reason and to human language that we will never be able to cross. And they all kind of boil back down to the same thing, the same question of, what does it mean to be rational? What does it mean to have a reason to do something or to believe something? What does it mean to have a reason to love your neighbor as yourself? What does it mean to have a reason to believe a conclusion based on the premises? So now ethics, that boils down to reasons, and logic, that boils down to reasons, have the same thing, and they just happen to, in meta-ethics, you can't really answer the question, what is a reason? People have tried, we're just not doing it. And I'm a meta-ethicist primarily. In logic, the question can be rephrased, how do premises give you probabilistic reasons to believe something? And we just haven't been able to answer it. You see how those kind of are parallel problems? And the idea is maybe there's a core there, and that this is a question of the nature of rationality itself, of what it is to have reasons to believe, reasons to do. And if you ask questions like, why do I have a reason to do this? The why question itself, you're asking, what's the reason why I have a reason? And then you're just done. Like, you just can't go further. Okay, I'll talk about that next time. Anyway, any more questions, comments, concerns?
The answer will be on the honors supplement to this
All right, I'll see you a bit later.